A little bit about myself, obviously a good test taker, have a few credentials there. I'm a senior manager in our audit and assurance department. I'm a director of the System Security and Process Assurance Group. Stone Carley is a traditional full-service accounting firm. We've just happened to build a national practice centered around these service organization control reports and some of our other information security offerings. So, based out of St. Louis, was lucky enough to be at a conference already here and decided to participate. First time I've been introduced to Scale Matrix, first time I've seen their facility, great facility. I've been to a number of data centers and certainly never seen anything like that. So very, very appreciative of being here and the opportunity to get in front of everybody today. The agenda really looks at three main parts. We're going to look a little bit at the past and why we changed and what I'll say information security, data management, managed IT services did as a part of that change. Then I'm going to run you through our current state. History isn't as important anymore because we've now been in this service organization control environment for almost 18 months now. So it's less and less important how we got here and more important about what it means now that we're here. Then lastly, I'll answer a few frequently asked questions that I have prepped, and obviously anything from the audience is welcome. So we're getting up to 3 or 4 now, so that's awesome. I am going to take a picture of this later because the folks at home are going to get a kick out of that. Again, a brief touch on the past. If you guys have been through the SSAE 16 or another SOC engagement, you've probably heard of SAS 70. That was the predecessor of all of this service organization control reporting. It was almost 20 years old when it was finally superseded. SAS 70 was always meant to cover systems that related to internal controls over financial reporting. Always has been, and even in the change, an element of that remains. It was meant as a restricted report, only auditor-to-auditor communication. It was not meant for general use, marketing, customers, anything like that. On the bottom there, I note that there were systrust and web trusts, which were governed by the trust principles and criteria, something I'll talk about at length here in the middle of the presentation. But I did want to point out that they actually did exist for at least the latter half of SAS 70's life. SAS 70 obviously blew up with Sarbanes-Oxley and a lot of the accounting troubles that happened in the early 2000s. But really, towards the end of its life, it was a needed and necessary change. And quite honestly, the needed and necessary change was driven by folks like you guys. The proliferation of outsourcing of information technology and other managed IT services really drove the need for something different, and in addition to a report on the internal controls over a financial reporting system. Now again, we did have tools out there to perform that service. It just wasn't well accepted. It wasn't well brought in. It wasn't marketed right by our profession. It wasn't generally accepted by the market or the public. And really, through this change to SSAE 16, we've rebranded and repackaged what I mentioned a few slides earlier. So what was SAS 70 has now been expanded and refocused to include some of those engagements that used to be called, and to some extent still are called, the systrust and web trust. What it does, though, is again rebrand and remarket them under Service Organization Control Reporting, so SOC reports. And as a note, it was effective for periods ending on or after June 15 of last year, so you should never see a SAS 70 report really again. They are now extinct. Little graphical interpretation of what the changes have brought about. So on the far left, when you're looking there at the screen, that's SOC 1. That's technically what we mean when we say SSAE 16. This SOC 1 report maintains what SAS 70 is always meant to be, and that's it covers internal controls over financial reporting. What's been rebranded and brought back to the forefront are the middle and the far right columns, the SOC 2 and the SOC 3. Again, these are based on trust principles and criteria, which have been in place for well over a decade now. Last updated in 2009, but certainly been available to practitioners like myself to issue reports on systems like you guys have. Any managed IT system could have been reported on previously, but again, not well accepted by the market. This rebranding then hopefully, and I think has done a very good job of re-educating the market on what the difference is between these and the need for each of them. I will say that there's a lot of commonality and similarity, but in different ways. So when we talk about a SOC 1 and a SOC 2, those are going to look the same, but their content's going to be different. A SOC 2 and a SOC 3, their content's going to be the same, but they're going to look completely different. And again, in the same family, some commonalities. SOC 1s and 2s, restricted reports. You really want to limit this to customers or management that know your operations, know what you're doing, and understand what you're doing. SOC 3 is a general use report. It's actually a true public seal. The documentation or the reporting behind it is very limited. The public sees very little, but they know that behind it, you're meeting these trust principles and criteria. And we'll get into some of the details of what those are in a few slides. In case a picture doesn't help, I've put more words out there just to re-discuss some of these concepts. Again, a SOC 1, when I say that, I also mean SSAE 16. When I say SSAE 16, I mean SOC 1. Those are interchangeable. They are not interchangeable with what a SOC 2 or a SOC 3 is. Interestingly, SSAE 16 brought about additional guidance. It's an audit guide for those of us in the practice. That audit guide is what has established and driven what a SOC 2 and a SOC 3 really is. Again, based on the trust principles and criteria. What's important for a group like this, or generally for a group like this in the managed IT or information security space, is that, and you have to remember, the reason for the change was driven by you guys, driven by the proliferation of outsourced IT services. Well, now you guys are stuck, because now both apply to you quite distinctly under the current guidance. So you're almost stuck with doing both. If you or your company host or manage anyone's infrastructure or IT system that includes their accounting system or financial reporting system, or something material to their financial reporting system, like their inventory system or ERP system, they're going to probably ask you for one, and rightfully so. Under the current guidance, it does say that a SOC 1 is necessary when infrastructure is hosted that includes accounting resources or things material to financial statements. Honestly, as a practitioner, I think that's inappropriate. Most of the things that affect our financial statement risk, and I am truly an accountant at heart, so I still do work in the numbers outside of information security. Most of the things that affect my risk to the financial statements are accounted for in SOC 2s and 3s under the trust principles and criteria. Primarily logical access and physical security and things of those nature. I'm not sure if this is going to work. But again, you guys were a reason for the change. No, it's not going to work. You guys are a reason for the change, and you're paying part of the price. So that link right there was to a great cartoon. It's a Mr. RFP comes by and says, hey, data center, a managed IT service provider, do you have an SSAE 16? They say, no, but we have a SOC 2, and that fits you a little better. They say, well, our checklist says SSAE 16, we need that. Can we get that from you? And then we'll talk about the SOC 2 or 3. And that's kind of the common balance that folks like you guys, I think, are going through, that they're asking for something that probably isn't as beneficial to them as something else. And unfortunately for you, that puts the emphasis on education. If you have a provider that you're using that has helped educate you, you want to then educate the users on what's best for them. But based on their checklist or based on their users, maybe they're not educated enough to know that a SOC 2 or a SOC 3 is more appropriate than a SOC 1. I threw up some control objectives. One of the drawbacks or one of the common complaints of a SOC 1 is that there are no established on paper, here's what you have to do to pass a SOC 1. That's actually by design. So as a provider, I can understand the concept. SOC 1 was meant to encapture a number of different industries. So this could apply to you guys as managed IT service providers or data centers. It definitely applies to payroll processors or third-party administrators that process claims. Too many differences across spectrums of industries to apply specific control objectives or guidance. So it's, again, generally taken from the perspective of financial statement risk And these are some examples of what you might see in a SOC 1. Organization administration, which would be some HR and training, physical security, environmental controls, logical access, system development lifecycle, new client setup or transition, things of that nature. On the left side, it could be a whole bunch of stuff, and I just threw a couple things in there. That is completely specific to what your operations are and what system you're providing to your clients that has some sort of financial statement risk, which is why they're asking. So again, you guys drove the change, and now you're paying the price. So we talked about the trust principles and criteria. I've mentioned them a number of times. These are the trust principles. All buzzwords that I'm sure you're familiar with. Security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, privacy. Again, they've been around for a while. They were last updated in 2009. They're probably due for another update very soon. But again, this is what, as opposed to a SOC 1, this is what drives a SOC 2 or a SOC 3. These are established principles. They go a step further. In the next slide, I'll show you they have established criteria that have to be met if they're applicable. So much more formal, much more defined and designed than a SOC 1. The flexibility of a SOC 1 is nice, but I think the assurance of a SOC 2 is even better. When it comes to a SOC 2 or a SOC 3, you can get an opinion on any one trust principle or any combination of trust principles. So you can get a SOC 2 or a SOC 3 on just security. You can get a SOC 2 or a SOC 3 on security and processing integrity, and any combination thereof. You do not have to get all 5. You do not have to get any certain one. You can do any one you need, any one your customers need. Again, a user-driven report. So when you ask me, I don't know what I need, my first question would be, is anybody asking for it? Let's ask them what they need. And that's what would drive ultimately what you get. That's what I referred to a second ago. 4 out of the 5 principles are very, very, very similar. Security, availability, processing integrity, and confidentiality. Those principles are broken up into 4 sets of criteria. First set of criteria support policies. You got to write down what you do. They got to be documented. They got to be reviewed and approved regularly. All of those normal things. But policies and procedures have to be there, and they have to be documented. Second set of criteria relate to communication. How do you communicate those not only to external users and customers, but to your internal staff and employees? Third set are the procedures, which should be enumerated in the policies. So are you actually performing what your policies say? And the last bit, obviously monitoring. What are you doing to monitor the entire system, your policies, communication, and procedures? Each of those criteria in the publicly available trust principles and criteria also have illustrative controls. So you're probably bombarded by frameworks, controls from other places. This is just another reference or a resource as well. So if you're wondering how exactly do I meet this criteria, it also provides some background on what you can do and some examples on what to do to meet that criteria. There is a lot of commonality across the principles. So obviously, of those 4 principles having similar sets of criteria, definitely some duplication. So don't think this is 4 separate principles that need complete isolation or are done independent of each other. Obviously, security is pervasive through any of these principles that we talked about. And you're going to have elements of security throughout all of them. So these aren't altogether mutually exclusive. There is certainly some economies of scale as you add principles onto your engagements because there are some similarities throughout. I want to talk about each trust principle a little bit in a little bit more detail. The security trust principle is the most common one that we've obviously started with many of our new clients and those getting familiar with SOC 2 and SOC 3 reports. It's the most pervasive, the most generally applicable across users' needs. Generally described, it's the protection of the system, both logical access and physical unauthorized access, permitting appropriate authorized access and preventing unauthorized access in all other instances is the technical definition of how that's brought out. Again, very pervasive throughout the other trust principles as well. Duplication, other things like that. Certainly other things top of mind that permeate through all the trust principles are things like change management, incident response. All of those things you'll see throughout all of these principles. Being primarily at a data center here, this one is most applicable to folks like Scale Matrix and those that provide data center type services. Obviously the accessibility or availability, the key point I want to point out there is there's not a minimum acceptable performance level that we're auditing against. It's whatever you're promising your users, whatever you're promising your customers or the market. So that's a very important aspect of what that is, because honestly sometimes that's the hardest part of scope. Do you audit against your most stringent SLA agreements, or do we audit for individual SLA agreements? We can do it both ways. There's some cost and consideration differences that way. But it's always important to maybe make that note so that you try to make your SLA agreements and your customer commitments as universal as possible. Obviously, quite a bit of customization, though, goes on. But an element of why sometimes these scopes can get a little bit difficult to ascertain. Doesn't address system functionality, doesn't address system usability, just access to the system for whatever you've committed to. Processing integrity generally applies if you are actually doing something on behalf of your client. Do you have something that is an input and a process and an output? This sometimes is not applicable to managed IT service providers, like help desk functions definitely comes into play, but general network administration and maintenance, not necessarily a key point here. But again, available in a situation where financial reporting or internal controls over financial reporting aren't as important and you need a more distinct set of criteria to go against, that's where transaction processing or data processing would best fit in the processing integrity trust principle. Confidentiality trust principle, probably the second most popular trust principle when we've gone through and performed the last 18 months worth of engagements. Another emphasis on not a definition of confidentiality, it's defined by the service organization, it's defined by you. And we audit against what you've committed or agreed to with your users or with your customers. The only real definitional consideration there is excludes personal information, which is generally defined by either regulation or other types of frameworks that you might apply. It applies to both. Confidentiality would apply both to data in transit and data at rest. Privacy trust principle is very unique, and from a market-facing perspective, I'll be very honest, we haven't done one. I don't think many people have. It's extensive. We've lost video. You got it? Sorry. No problem. It is extensive. It's a tremendous. My next slide will show that probably a little bit better, or my next couple slides. But a significant amount of effort would go into a privacy audit under a SOC 2 or a SOC 3. It's governed by something we call generally accepted privacy principles. So again, if you're not familiar with it, it's another framework. You guys have a whole bunch of other frameworks available to you. For SOC 2 and 3 purposes, it's required, but if you're not going through that process yet and would like to benchmark yourself against something, we call it GAP-P. GAP-P would be one of the things that you can do that for. GAP-P really provides 10 sets of criteria. So remember, the other 4 that we've talked about each had 4 sets of criteria: policies, communications, procedures, and monitoring. These are a little more detailed, a little more in-depth, significantly around not only what you do, but how you communicate it, what your privacy notice says, how you use, retain, and dispose of data, much more detailed. Show that a little differently. I really like this slide. It kind of tends to show, as I've mentioned, privacy engagements are rare, and this is why. They basically outnumber, almost outnumber, all the others combined, which, to put it in more practical terms, means they're really, really expensive. It's also a good slide to note there, the individual criteria. So again, through those 4 sections of the other 4 principles and criteria, again, policies, communication, procedures, and monitoring. You have anywhere from 25 to 32 different criteria to meet to be able to receive an unqualified opinion on a SOC 2 or a SOC 3. Does anybody have any access to or participation in financial statement audits? So I get a funny look when I say you get an unqualified opinion, and that's a good thing. That means there's no qualification to the report that would tell you that something's wrong. So it's not unqualified in the sense that you might first think of when you hear that. Any questions on that? I went through that pretty quick. Any questions on the 5 trust principles and criteria, details inside of them or anything like that? Generally, we come across some pretty frequently asked questions. So I've put a few of them up there or through these slides that we can talk about. In the picture slide of where we are now after SSAE 16 and the related guidance that have provided us SOC 1, 2, and 3 reports, in the SOC 1 and the SOC 2 realms, you can get 2 different types of reports. One's called a Type 1, one's called a Type 2. The most important thing actually isn't on this slide. A Type 1 is a point-in-time report. It does not cover a period. It only covers the description of your system and the design of your controls as of that day. Obviously, you can't really rely on that too much. A Type 2 covers a period of time. In a SOC 1 instance, it needs to be 6 months. In a SOC 2 instance, it needs to be at least 2 months. Did I repeat 2 months? SOC 1 is 6 months. SOC 2 is 2 months. And that's what provides your users the true alliance. So in a SOC 1 environment, if other auditors are requiring it, they're not going to be able to rely on a Type 1. They're not going to accept it. So be very clear with your users what you're getting and what you need. The second note's very important, and what we actually highly recommend. While it's generally discouraged, as we note in the first step, to get a Type 1, there are plenty of instances where it's appropriate. One is if controls haven't been in place for a sufficient amount of time, and the other is in preparation for a SOC 2. Fully understandable and practical to make this a waterfall approach. Get a readiness assessment. Get a Type 1 the next year. Get a Type 2 the second year. Saves you money, saves you time, makes the whole process a little more acceptable. That is, of course, if it's acceptable to your users. Some users require a Type 2 out of the chute, and if you need to meet that obligation, then you need to meet that obligation. But in the instance where you're just trying to prepare, or you're seeing more RFPs that say you need this, I would definitely recommend the waterfall approach to get yourself to a Type 2. Or if you communicate with your client your intentions and your plan, and they sign off and are acceptable to that, fantastic. Next most frequently asked question is, what do I get? What's my deliverable? For a SOC 1 and a SOC 2, remember I said these are very similar in form, but they're different in content. So this is a general form of what you'll get. A SOC 1 and SOC 2 are very detailed. You get 5 sections generally of information, 4 for sure, in a Type 2. Audit opinion report is the first section. Management assertion was established with these recent changes. That's just a fancy way of saying management is taking responsibility for this report and for this system. I'm only opining on it as an auditor. The intention was to more clearly identify that it's not an auditor report, it's your report as a service organization. Third is very important, and often when first starting, the most difficult. It's a true description of the system. Very detailed. Whatever your system is that we're covering, whether it be the network administration system or the VoIP system or the help desk function, whatever it is, it's a step-by-step discussion, very proprietary, very detailed, and included in the report. Generally, the system includes these 5 elements. What's your infrastructure? What's your software? Who are your people? What are your procedures? And what types of data are used and supported by the system? Again, this is very detailed information. We're opining on the description. It has to be as accurate and complete as possible. In fact, our opinion says it's as accurate, in auditor speak, it's accurate and complete. What's important then in the fourth section there is testing of controls. That's only applicable in a type 2. So you'll actually have, usually in tabular format, in a SOC 1, you'll have control objectives listed, controls that meet that control objectives, our testing, and our results of testing. In a SOC 2, you'll have the criteria listed, our testing, and our results of testing. In a type 1, generally only the controls are listed in relation to the description of the system. No testing's performed, no testing's reported on. Generally, section 4 is left out of a type 1. Section 5 is a catch-all. Usually we disclaim any opinion on that section 5. But this is where you can market yourself even further. Hey, we have all these other, Cisco and Microsoft certifications and designations. We have other, anything else that you could think of. We don't opine on this. It's kind of a marketing catch-all that you can discuss and describe what you do and how you do it. One of the really interesting things about the changes that came into play is that as an auditor, we can incorporate other frameworks into these reports. The SOC 2 sits as the base, but you can layer on other frameworks and other things that you need to meet and actually get an opinion on whether or not you meet them. So there's not many out there there's not many services or not many deliverables that can get you an unrelated third-party opinion that you've met HIPAA security and privacy rules. There's really not many out there. For a period of time even, we can do that. You can layer in ISO 27001, GLBA, CSA, CAB Forum, any frameworks or discussions you need, we can do it. Problem is, not many people have done it yet. It's difficult. Our governing body has not provided specific guidance on even how to report on it. It just says that you can. We're certainly more than willing, but and quite honestly, cost shouldn't even play much into this because most of the trust principles and criteria, if you're getting a SOC 2, can map to these things pretty easy. So we're talking about additional effort to get this reported on, but not so significant that it's cost prohibitive. And actually pretty excited in the service organizations that we work with, one of the types of them are third-party administrators. We do quite a bit of work with that group. HIPAA security and privacy are very important to those constituents and those users. And we're actively mapping and documenting and finishing up the process of getting this into our reports and trying to cost that out to make sure that, almost as a value add, you can now opine on these things to give your users and customers more confidence. Won't hurt if a regulator happens to come in and you fall under. I don't know if you've heard, but the OCR, Office of Civil Rights, which enforces HIPAA, recently began a proactive audit program for covered entities. So if you have covered entities as customers, hospitals, medical group practices, providers, they may have been chosen for audit, and they may have to bring you in as a provider to say, how are you helping me meet these security and privacy rules? OCR is kind of one of those government offices, and many are going in this direction, that are self-fulfilling. So as they levy, as their budget is cut, and their levying of fines is now supporting their operations. So obviously they're very, very motivated to find problems and to find issues. And again, just this fourth quarter of 2012 is the first time they've proactively enforced HIPAA. It's been always on a notification or breach consideration. When something happens, you're required to report it to HHS or OCR. Now they're going out and auditing you on a more proactive basis. I don't know if everybody got to hear me when I first started off. The title of this presentation that you see flashing on all, if you've been educated by good providers or you know this, it says in my title that was provided to Scale Matrix certifications. Completely wrong. There's another CPA here. I'll hide from him because it's almost a little embarrassing that my title says that. Somehow, the business development folks that got me in touch with Scale Matrix, something got lost in translation and my title got a little messed up. These aren't certifications. These are engagements that have to meet certain criteria and rules. We try not to use the certification language. With the change, though, the AICPA's decided to confuse that process even more So even though we're not supposed to call it a certification, you now have a logo, which is very different than a seal. I don't know why. I don't really know how to say why it is. But this logo can be put on your website. It can be put on your marketing materials, anything you'd like. If it's on your website, it technically has to be linked to an AICPA hosted page that describes what SOC reports are. But it's helpful. I'll show you why in a minute. For SOC 3s and systrust and web trust, the verbiage around what SOC 3s are, you can get basically a SOC 3 systrust, a SOC 3 web trust. Difference between web trust and systrust: web trust are for e-commerce systems, systrust are for non-e-commerce systems. But if you get a SOC 3, that's what your public seal would look like. So you can post that on your website. You can, if users click on that, that's where they would find the limited reporting. Again, the deliverable is basically that seal with very minimal documentation behind it. Your provider will have the documentation of the meeting the criteria and all of that in their work papers, but as opposed to a SOC 2, where I mentioned you would get tables that described all your controls and the testing that we did. You would have a large description of the system, huge document. This, you don't have that. Definitely a more market-facing, marketing, public-facing perspective. You used to see this a lot. It says certified SAS 70. I have no idea where this came from. That's not appropriate. So again, it's not a certification. It's an engagement. You've met the criteria needed to get an unqualified opinion. Again, just to make it as confusing as all possible. One of the best questions I get is, why the heck am I listening to a CPA tell me about information security? It's a fair statement. Just so happens, first and foremost, that SOC reporting must be issued by a CPA firm licensed by the AICPA. So certainly you can work with consultants that partner with a CPA firm. That's commonplace. We don't do it, but it is commonplace in the market, where a CPA firm will maybe do more quality control and review and then issue that opinion on their letterhead, while consultants on the back end do most of the field work. Consultants who are very information security qualified. It's certainly under the rules, so I wouldn't say it's inappropriate at all. But it's a difficult process, and certainly I would recommend to you to find a true full-fledged CPA firm that has the IT audit experience to go through this process directly. It's just when you get too many cooks in the kitchen, it sometimes is a difficult process. But beyond that, CPAs are, we have our foundation in data. We have our foundation maybe in numbers, but those numbers are fed by processes and data of systems. We have that ability and that thought process and our own processes to make the audit process as easy for you as possible. The key caveat I would say is obviously make sure your IT or your CPA firm that you do choose does put an emphasis on establishing IT audit and information security as a priority. I think all professional service firms, when you ask them if they do something, will always say yes, sure. What is that again? But obviously, those that invest the time and the resources into ensuring their teams are, IT audit expertise and have IT and information security experience is important. And probably the elephant usually in the room is, well, how much does it cost? And that's just, unfortunately, I'm not going to give you an answer because it's such a nebulous answer. You have to be careful. We're a small firm, one office. We compete often with large regional firms and big four national firms. So I put a caveat in there that in those instances, don't worry about the low-cost provider, because sometimes that's us. But certainly be careful of bargain basement, low-cost providers. Generally, those consultant CPA relationships are the ones that are really trying to cut the cost and get in the door. I talked about type 1 versus type 2. Type 1 is generally 50 to 60% of the type 2 cost, basically because we're doing everything but the testing, and the testing is the other half. So it really is kind of a good barometer of where you're at. Other cost considerations would be your number of locations that process or store data, depending on what system we're covering. Do they include all those locations? Is that data or is that processing done at one location? That affects scope, that affects cost. The maturity of your own internal control environment. use of homegrown applications. If you're building it from scratch, then we got a whole SDLC type discussion that is certainly more complex than if you're just using stuff off the shelf. And note that sample selections are driven by a number of factors. So you have to consider the frequency of controls, the volume of data or transactions, and the length of time we're covering. If it's 6 months, if it's 2 months, if it's a year. All of that plays into sample selection size and cost. I will reiterate, though, too, that when you go through a SOC 2 or a SOC 3, it's not an incremental. Well, it is an incremental. It's not a times 2 or times 3 if you were to get 1 trust principal versus 3. So because of that commonality, because of that duplication, you're talking about a fractional incremental cost. So if, just throwing numbers out there, if you're starting at $25,000 for a security type 2 SOC 2, maybe a type 2 SOC 2 on security and confidentiality would only be $30,000, not $50,000. Those relationships depend on the system again, but it shouldn't be a 25, 50, 75, 100 type of situation. So that was long and short. I appreciate almost 10 of you that actually sat down and listened. Is there any other questions, comments, considerations? Has everybody here gone through this process before or considering going through this? I know Stephen talked early. You have been through the process. Have you done a SOC 1 and a SOC 2 or just one or the other?
Just SOC 1,
Type 2 SOC 1. You know, all I would say is, you know, part of why we want to do this, I am, you know, passionate about educating not just my customers, but my clients and customers' customers. You know, if you're in the managed IT space, if you're in the data center space, I want to get you guys away from having to get SOC 1s. There's just not as much value there to users, and there's not as much value there to you as an organization. SOC 2 is where it's at. SOC 2 is where it should be. There's discussion inside the AICPA, which governs this for CPAs, and it's a hotly debated topic. The problem is those auditors that are still asking for SOC 1 is because they're not, in a profession that likes to tout its professional judgment, they're not using any professional judgment. The guidance says we need a report on internal control over financial reporting. Since SOC 1 specifically says that, that's why they're asking for SOC 1. In my opinion, we can use our professional judgment and apply the elements of the SOC 2 report to our risk of misstatement when it comes to internal controls over financial reporting. And in that sense, it meets everybody's needs and would be much more valuable to you guys. So I'm personally pushing for that change. I'm hoping that change comes through. And there is some talk that it might be that way. But in all honesty, the audit guide for a SOC 1 even says if you're a data center and you host accounting systems, you need a SOC 1. So it's in our guidance right now, and we're hoping to, I'm personally hoping that changes in the not too distant future. And certainly I would, unfortunately, as I mentioned before, I'm not sure if you were here, you guys were the driver of the change from SAS 70, because not everything you do relates to internal controls over financial reporting. And now you're paying the price because technically both reports are applicable to you, which is more costly for you to comply with. But hopefully the more we educate, the more the users and customers are educated. Hopefully that changes. And I'm certainly in favor of that, for sure. Any other questions, comments? All right. Well, thanks for having me.